Yo, stop scrolling. Right now. Because what just leaked about Rick Ross is uglier than the sales sheet, and it is worse than anything 50 Cent typed on Instagram this week. Rick Ross did not just flop. Rick Ross got financially executed in slow motion, in public, on a Billboard chart that used to belong to Rick Ross. And the receipts are so brutal that even the people who wanted Rick Ross to win are pretending they never pressed play. This is not a hip-hop story anymore. This is a business obituary with a beat behind it. Let me set the scene, because half the internet is arguing about the wrong number. Rick Ross dropped an album called Set in Stone. Rick Ross hyped Set in Stone like the second coming of Teflon Don. Rick Ross went on Joe Budden. Rick Ross went on every podcast that would open a door. Rick Ross put 20 features on a 19-track album. Yeah, read that again. Rick Ross stacked 20 guest appearances into 19 songs, which mathematically means Rick Ross was outnumbered by Rick Ross's own guests on Rick Ross's own project. And then the first week landed. And the internet did not laugh. The internet cackled. Here is the number nobody wants to say out loud in one clean sentence. So let me say it. Set in Stone opened at roughly 17,200 units. Number 45 on the Billboard 200. Some early rumors whispered a shocking 2,000 copies in pure sales. And even though that specific 2,000 figure was never officially confirmed, the rumor spread faster than any single Rick Ross tried to push. That is the part everyone missed. It did not matter if the 2,000 figure was accurate. It only mattered that people believed it long enough to meme it. Perception ate the truth for breakfast, and the internet never spit it back out. But here's the layer nobody on YouTube is talking about. Everybody keeps blaming Drake. Everybody keeps blaming 50 Cent. Everybody keeps blaming the algorithm. Nobody is talking about the empty seats. Nobody is talking about the buy one, get 50% off tickets on the tour. Nobody is talking about the venue map in Miami that looked like a green traffic light because so many chairs were still available. In Miami, Rick Ross's home turf. The city Rick Ross built a whole persona around. Rick Ross could not sell out Miami. Read that sentence twice and let it burn a hole through your screen. Now let me tell you what the real story is, because I've been staring at this for days, and everybody is chasing the wrong villain. The villain is not Drake. The villain is not 50 Cent. The villain is a math problem Rick Ross created with Rick Ross's own hands. Rick Ross went missing from music. Not for a year. Not for two. For close to 2 decades of relevance decay. And Rick Ross tried to reappear like nothing happened. Like the culture was going to catch Rick Ross the way the culture caught Rick Ross back when Aston Martin music was a ringtone in every parking lot. That culture is gone. That culture moved on. That culture is currently arguing about Aiden Ross streams instead of Rick Ross streams. And that is not a joke. That is a receipt served with ice. 50 Cent hopped on Instagram like a landlord who just found a rent check bouncing back. 50 Cent posted, and I quote, laughing out loud, he got away with it for a while, but it is over now. Jig is up. 20 features under 10,000 sales. Damn boy, it is over. And then 50 Cent went nuclear again a couple posts later, adding, I just saw your record sales. LOL. 2,000. What? The comment sections did not need popcorn. The comment sections were the popcorn. 50 Cent even brought up Tory Lanez, pulling 19,700 units the first week out, outselling Rick Ross by more than 2,000 units. Tory Lanez. From behind a wall. That is not a diss. That is a coroner's report. Then Rick Ross clapped back. Rick Ross went on IG Live from backstage at a 20-year anniversary celebration and told the world, do not let the first week make or break you. Rick Ross said, when Basquiat painted Masterpiece, he never knew what it was worth. Rick Ross compared Set in Stone to a Basquiat. And listen, that is a beautiful sentiment on a therapist's couch. But this is Billboard. Billboard is not a therapist. Billboard is a scoreboard. And the scoreboard said Rick Ross lost round 1, round 2, and round 3 all at the same time. Rick Ross is not painting. Rick Ross is bleeding units. Here's where the story gets deeper. Because the mainstream is missing the biggest layer of this whole collapse. Are you ready? Because you're not going to hear this take anywhere else. The reason Set in Stone flopped is not Drake. It is not 50 Cent. It is the algorithm nobody controls. And Rick Ross accidentally admitted it. In a recent interview, when asked why the numbers looked the way they did, someone in Rick Ross's orbit said, and Rick Ross's team floated the same idea, that the algorithm is against Rick Ross because Rick Ross beef with Drake, and Drake's fan base overlaps with Rick Ross's fan base by an ugly margin. Some estimates online said 50 to 80% overlap, meaning every time Rick Ross took a shot at Drake, Rick Ross was firing bullets into Rick Ross's own audience. Rick Ross was not beefing with Drake. Rick Ross was beefing with Rick Ross's payroll. Think about it. Rick Ross's biggest smashes, the songs that made Rick Ross a household name outside of hip-hop nerds. They were Drake features, Aston Martin music. Let me show you. Made Men. The Rick Ross radio empire was built on a Drake foundation. And when Rick Ross tore that foundation down last year, Rick Ross did not just lose a friend. Rick Ross lost a streaming pipeline. Rick Ross lost the passive listeners who let Rick Ross play in the background of their gym sessions and their late night drives because Drake was on the hook. That audience is not evil. That audience is not a hive mind. That audience just made a choice, and the choice was not Rick Ross. And then 50 Cent poured gasoline on the whole thing, because that is what 50 Cent does for a living now. 50 Cent is not a rapper anymore. 50 Cent is a professional online demolition contractor with a Grammy on the shelf. And Rick Ross gave 50 Cent the perfect week to reactivate a beef that has been simmering since 2009. Rick Ross fired first. Rick Ross said 50 Cent needed to give Shreveport its money back. Rick Ross said 50 Cent had not destroyed Rick Ross's career because Rick Ross was still up while Fat Joe's last album sold 8,300 copies and Triple C's did 4,000. Rick Ross was doing math to prove Rick Ross was winning. Rick Ross was doing math on a losing scoreboard. 50 Cent's response was surgical. 50 Cent did not rap. 50 Cent did not go on Sway. 50 Cent just typed. 50 Cent posted screenshots. 50 Cent tagged the numbers. 50 Cent said, "You punching below your weight." 50 Cent said, "This is me fighting the fighters that are challenging me." 50 Cent said, "Because you went to the gym the first few days and the coach called you champ, do not mean you're ready to fight Floyd Mayweather." And the internet cracked open like an egg. Because it was funny. Because it was cold. Because it was true. Truth hits harder than any punchline in this era. But let me pull you out of the beef for a second, because there is a bigger picture nobody is showing you. And this is the angle nobody has touched. Nobody. Not Joe Budden. Not DJ Academics. Not Tony Yayo. Not Uncle Murder. Not one commentator in this whole cycle. Ready? Rick Ross did not flop because of Drake. Rick Ross did not flop because of 50 Cent. Rick Ross flopped because the entire promotional playbook Rick Ross grew up on does not exist anymore. Rick Ross launched Set in Stone using a 2011 marketing strategy in a 2026 attention economy. And the culture punished Rick Ross the way it punishes any executive who refuses to update the software. Look at the rollout. There was no lead single that took over TikTok. There was no viral snippet. There was no meme campaign. There was no exclusive listening event that trended for a week. Rick Ross did what Rick Ross always did. Rick Ross went on the classic podcast circuit. Rick Ross did the boat photos. Rick Ross did the car show. Rick Ross posted the luxury lifestyle. And Rick Ross expected the results Rick Ross used to get when radio was king, and streaming platforms did not decide who gets fed. That world is gone. The kids picking playlists do not care about the boat. The kids picking playlists want a snippet, a hook, a moment. Rick Ross gave them 20 features stacked on top of each other like Jenga blocks and asked them to find the melody. And here's the darkest part. Rick Ross tried to jump ahead of the flop. There were reports, and this is wild, that Rick Ross's team was moving faster than usual because Rick Ross could feel the numbers coming. There was a promotional push. There was a press run. There was an interview blitz. Rick Ross went to Joe Budden, and clips got pulled. Rick Ross sat down, and clips got sliced. But every clip the internet chose to amplify was not about the music. Every clip was about Drake. Every clip was about 50 Cent. Every clip was about the beef. Rick Ross tried to promote an album, and the internet promoted a war. Rick Ross could not outshout Rick Ross's own drama. The tour situation is even more painful. A video started circulating showing the seating chart for one of Rick Ross's Miami dates on this 20-year anniversary run. And the green dots were everywhere. Green dots meaning open seats, meaning empty, meaning available, meaning nobody bought them. And then Rick Ross's team started offering a buy one, get 50% off deal. 50%. In Miami. On Rick Ross tickets. That is not a promotion. That is a distress signal wearing a smile. Now let me be fair, because I am not here to bury Rick Ross. Rick Ross is a legend. Rick Ross has 2 classic albums, even Rick Ross's harshest critics cannot deny. Rick Ross built a diversified empire outside of music that most rappers would kill for. Rick Ross has the car show. Rick Ross has the properties. Rick Ross has the licensing money that is going to keep coming as long as Aston Martin music exists in a radio server somewhere. Rick Ross is going to be fine financially. Rick Ross will book bigger tours in smaller venues. Rick Ross will land brand deals. Rick Ross will keep the boat. But that is exactly the problem. Because we are not evaluating Rick Ross the businessman. We are evaluating Rick Ross the rapper. And Rick Ross the rapper just walked into 2026 wearing a 2011 suit, and the Mirror did not lie. The Mirror said, "Rick Ross, you're not the biggest name on your own album cover." The Mirror said, "Rick Ross, your feature list is longer than your fan list." The Mirror said, "Rick Ross, the culture moved." And Rick Ross looked at the Mirror and said the Mirror was rigged by Drake. Now, let me hit you with the wildest domino nobody is watching. Larry June. Larry June's latest project reportedly opened with better first-week numbers than Set in Stone. Larry June, an independent artist. No major machine. Number 20 features. Just consistency, a specific lane, and an audience that actually listens instead of scrolls. And that is the receipt that should keep Rick Ross up at night. Because Larry June is not more famous than Rick Ross. Larry June is not richer than Rick Ross. Larry June is not louder than Rick Ross. Larry June just understood the modern game, while Rick Ross was still playing the old one. And this is where I want you to lean in, because here comes the part every other channel skipped. 50 Cent's Instagram trolling is not just entertainment. It is calculated psychological warfare, and Rick Ross keeps taking the bait. Every time Rick Ross replies, every time Rick Ross responds, every time Rick Ross posts a boat picture with a caption aimed at Curtis Jackson, 50 Cent wins a news cycle. 50 Cent does not need to sell an album this week. 50 Cent needs Rick Ross to keep responding. And Rick Ross keeps responding. Rick Ross is playing checkers on 50 Cent's chessboard, and every move Rick Ross makes clears more of Rick Ross's own pieces off the board. The Drake angle is the same trap in different clothes. Rick Ross keeps mentioning Drake. Rick Ross keeps taking shots. Rick Ross keeps saying Iceman was horrendous. Rick Ross keeps questioning whether Drake writes. And every time Rick Ross says Drake's name, Rick Ross feeds the algorithm that Drake already dominates. Drake does not need to respond. Drake does not need to diss back. Drake just needs to exist, because Rick Ross is doing all of Drake's marketing for free. This is a trap Rick Ross does not see. This is the loop Rick Ross cannot escape until Rick Ross closes Rick Ross's own mouth and lets the music breathe on its own. But here's my prediction, and write it down, because we will come back to this in 6 months. Rick Ross is not going to close Rick Ross's mouth. Rick Ross is going to keep feeding the drama, because drama is the only tool Rick Ross has left that still generates numbers. Views, clicks, podcast bookings. Rick Ross has learned that outrage sells better than choruses in 2026, and Rick Ross will lean into it. Rick Ross will keep dissing. Rick Ross will keep firing back. Rick Ross will keep giving 50 Cent content to mock, because that is the only economy left where Rick Ross is still profitable. Rick Ross cannot beat the streaming game, so Rick Ross will win the trending page. And you know what? Some people are going to eat it up. Some people are going to say Rick Ross is keeping hip-hop alive. Some people are going to say Rick Ross is entertaining. So it does not matter what the numbers say. Some people are going to say Set in Stone is a slept-on classic. And maybe those people are right. Maybe Set in Stone will age like wine. Maybe 5 years from now, a producer will sample a Set in Stone deep cut and put Rick Ross back on the radar. Maybe. But right now, in this moment, the scoreboard is not showing wine. The scoreboard is showing water. So let me ask you something before you close this video, because I want you to think about it. If Rick Ross had never beefed with Drake, would Set in Stone have opened bigger? Almost certainly yes. If Rick Ross had never given 50 Cent an opening this year, would Set in Stone have opened bigger? Almost certainly yes. If Rick Ross had spent the last 2 years dropping singles, feeding TikTok, building a snippet economy the way Drake did with Iceman, would Set in Stone have opened bigger? Absolutely yes. So the flop is not a mystery. The flop is a sum. Drake plus 50 Cent plus outdated marketing plus 20 features plus empty seats plus a culture that moved on equals 17,200 first week units. That is not a curse. That is math. And math is the coldest villain in this whole story. Because math does not care about legacy. Math does not care about classic albums. Math does not care about Miami. Math does not care about the boat. Math just counts. And when the counting stopped this week, Rick Ross was not on top. Rick Ross was not in the top 10. Rick Ross was at number 45. Behind acts Rick Ross would have laughed at 10 years ago. Behind Tory Lanez. Behind Larry June. Behind the culture Rick Ross helped build, and then forgot to keep updating with fresh code. 50 Cent knows this. 50 Cent has been screaming this from every social media rooftop for weeks. 50 Cent said, You need the Drake stimulus package, and that was not there for you. 50 Cent said, beefing with 50, that was not good for you. 50 Cent said, just find a new career. And even though 50 Cent is trolling, even though 50 Cent is trying to be funny, even though 50 Cent is being personal and mean and unfair, 50 Cent is not lying. That is the part that stings. 50 Cent's meanest jokes this week were factually accurate, and accurate jokes cannot be defeated. Accurate jokes just keep echoing across every timeline. Drake, meanwhile, has not said a single word publicly about Set in Stone. Drake has not commented. Drake has not liked a meme. Drake is not fired back. Drake is doing the thing that hurts Rick Ross the most. Drake is being quiet. Because Drake understands something Rick Ross has forgotten. Silence is louder than a diss when the numbers are already talking for you. Drake does not need to promote Drake's win. The scoreboard is doing it in real time, hour by hour, stream by stream. So what happens next? Here is what I see. Rick Ross doubles down. Rick Ross drops a follow-up single. Rick Ross does another interview cycle. Rick Ross takes another shot at 50 Cent. Rick Ross takes another shot at Drake. The internet turns it into memes. The tour continues to struggle. The buy one, get 50% off deals expand to other cities. Rick Ross's team spins the story as strategic. Rick Ross ends a year telling everyone Set in Stone was actually a success in a longer time frame. And by summer 2027, Rick Ross starts teasing a new album, promising this one is different, promising the streets are back, promising the boat is loaded again. That cycle will repeat until Rick Ross decides to stop or until the audience stops entirely. Because that is the thing about legacy in 2026. Legacy is not permanent. Legacy is a subscription. And Rick Ross let the subscription lapse. Rick Ross assumed the fans would auto-renew, and the fans did not. That is not cruelty. That is not disloyalty. That is just how attention works now. You cannot disappear for 2 decades of relevance decay and expect the algorithm to remember your face. The algorithm forgets. The algorithm always forgets. The algorithm only remembers who fed it yesterday. And Rick Ross was not on the menu. Somebody in the comments is about to type, but Rick Ross is still rich. But Rick Ross is still touring. But Rick Ross is still bigger than most of you. And you are right. All of that is true. But being rich is not the same as being relevant. Being on tour is not the same as selling tickets. Being bigger than a stranger on the internet is not the same as being bigger than your own last album. Rick Ross is not competing with commenters. Rick Ross is competing with 2011 Rick Ross. And 2011 Rick Ross would eat 2026 Rick Ross alive without spilling a drop of the sauce. Here's my final take, and I want you to sit with this. Rick Ross's biggest problem is not Drake. It is not 50 Cent. It is not the algorithm. Rick Ross's biggest problem is that Rick Ross still thinks Rick Ross is the same size Rick Ross was during Teflon Don. Rick Ross is not. And that gap between the self-image and reality is the crack every joke this week has walked through. 50 Cent is not creating the joke. 50 Cent is just pointing at the crack. Everybody else is pointing too. The only person who has not looked at the crack yet is Rick Ross. And until Rick Ross does, Rick Ross's next album will open exactly like this one. Loud rollout, boat pictures, beef, numbers, silence, repeat. So drop a comment. Tell me who you think is right in this whole mess. Was Set in Stone actually a flop, or was it a slow burn nobody is patient enough to appreciate? Is 50 Cent a bully or a mirror? Did Drake sink Rick Ross without saying a word? Or did Rick Ross sink Rick Ross before Drake ever entered the story? Because I want to know. I want the smoke. I want the theories. I want the receipts. Drop them below. Because we are not done talking about this. Not this week. Not next week. Not until Rick Ross drops the next album. And we run this math all over again. Like the video. Subscribe if you have not. Turn the bell on so you catch every update. Because when Rick Ross responds, and Rick Ross will respond, we are going to be the first ones back on this story. Because the story is not finished. Round 2 is where legends either resurrect or retire cold. And you will watch it happen live with me. Peace out. See you in the next one, family.